That's how we do it when we pull up to the dome.
Well, all right. Welcome to episode number 6 of the Bloodied and Bruised podcast. I am Taylor. Today I am joined by Miguel Ituarte. Miguel and I have literally known each other for maybe 15 minutes now. He was referenced to me by a gentleman named Ed Thyssen, and Ed has an incredible MMA Fight One collection, which we may touch on a little bit. He and Miguel run a channel as well, doing a podcast where Miguel interviews a ton of awesome people from the MMA industry, a lot of legendary fighters and people that were in their camps. So I just wanted to pick Miguel's brain, touch on some of the knowledge that he has that I definitely do not have, and I think he's got a lot of awesome stories. So Miguel, how are you doing, Bubba?
Doing great, and I'm glad to join you. This is always fun, meet new people, talk, fights. I talk a lot of fights with a lot of people, so whenever I get like a new person to talk to, it's always very interesting just to get different feels and perspectives. So thank you for having me.
Of course. So where are you tuning in from?
Well, I live in Costa Rica. I've been down here for more than 15 years now. I moved down here in 2007, 2008, that time frame. So I was doing the Bodog fights where Bodog has, outlets here in Costa Rica. We did some big shows down here with Bodog, film TV shows. So I kind of fell in love with the place, and I'm from New York originally, and now I don't need jackets, so I like it here.
Yeah, I bet it's a much different climate from New York. I've never been there. I've traveled to a lot of different places. Central South America is somewhere that I have yet to touch, but I've my family goes to Costa Rica, or has gone to Costa Rica quite a few times, and they always tell me, "Man, you would love it." So it's definitely on the list. If my family's saying they want to move there, then it must be awesome. So because they love their homes. So
yeah.
So when I first reached out to you, I asked you about, like, for lack of a better term, the old school era of UFC, and you said something about having gone to Japan for some Pride events, and if I remember correctly, being at least a little bit, if not a lot of it, involved with ADCC. So if you don't mind, I would love to touch on that and delve a little bit deeper, and also delve a little bit, I guess, into what initially got you into to martial arts, or MMA specifically. So yeah, hit us.
So like a lot of people my age, I'm my 50s, so it goes back to the 1990s. In 1993, November 12th was the first UFC. I was at a Jerry Garcia concert that day. So I actually came back and saw the UFC like on a tape delay or a VHS recording afterwards. I think UFC 12 was the first one I drove to. I went to every UFC from 12 to 33. Like when Dana and those guys bought it, I went to their first show, which was in Jersey. And then after that, I kind of stopped going. After going to the first UFC, I went with a buddy of mine, and he had kids. I didn't, and then I was like hooked. Live. I think that the live experience of seeing the fights is more impactful than actually watching them on TV. So I was like, okay, you look on the internet, and there was a small event in Evansville called Hook and Shoot, Evansville, Indiana. the following week, and I was like, "Hey, buddy, let's go." And he's like, "Man, it's a 10-hour drive. We just did a 10-hour drive to Georgia, I think it was." Um, so my buddy stayed home, and I went. And when I got to the hook and shoot, it was a one man show run by promoter Jeff Osborne, and we kind of hit it off. And I started working with him. He let me matchmake, and so we were the two headed beast in Evansville for a long time, where he was the promoter and I was the matchmaker. So I dealt with the fighters, and he dealt with the ticket sales. And from there it
So,
got big.
not to interrupt you, but you said Evansville, Indiana. Did you live there at any point?
No,
No.
yeah, I
It's
avoid Evansville if it's for living.
so
The
so I
people are great, but
actually
it's a little small town. I'm from central. At that time, I was living in central Pennsylvania.
so I spent I'm gonna call it let's call it 7 days, somewhere in that ballpark. I spent 7 days in Evansville. Um Earlier this year, probably springtime.
Okay.
Don't hold me to the dates. Doing an audio video installation in a attorney's office there. I had never been there. I'd spent some time in Indianapolis. Spent a lot of time in Indianapolis actually, and I had heard of Evansville, and never been there. And they flew me into Indy, and me and two AV installation technicians drove from Indy to Evansville, and yeah, it's a small town. When you were talking about fights there, it's like, well, that's interesting because
Yeah,
I've
I
been
think the War
downtown Evansville. It's
Memorial.
not a big spot.
Yeah, I think the War Memorial is still there. That's where we did most of our shows, which was three to 4,000 people arena. It's got some long history, and Jeff is from there, so I would show up for the shows. I haven't been to Evansville in since the mid 2000s. So I'm sure it's changed a little bit, but yeah, that's where I got my start, was with Evansville, and from there things got uh, we got to be known in the business. The Hook and Shoot show is kind of, in my estimation, a classic show where a lot of people got their start, and Jeff's a good promoter. I was a good kind of honest matchmaker, so people knew that it was like a fair show and that they were going to get paid and things like that. And that's where a lot of stuff in the sport comes from. People worried, the promoter's going to rip them off or whatever. So, from Hook and Shoot, we took it pretty big. But by the time we did the Bodog shows I mentioned before, I mean, I did the maybe I think that it might have been the second to last show that I did with Bodog was in a 20,000 seat arena in Russia. Fedor was the main event, so the we got we got to be pretty big, and it was enjoyable.
So what year would that have been, like the closeout, if you will? Like when did you stop working with Bodog?
Well, Bodog pulled the plug on their MMA in 2008, and I left, around that time. I think they did a show in Evansville actually with Jeff after I left. But by then it was starting to go south because Bodog the owners was a billionaire online casino guy, not allowed in the U.S. kind of thing. Um, and he was flamboyant, so we did shows in Russia, in Costa Rica, in Vancouver, Canada. And they always like to have big, nice locations. And then, I left, and their last closer show was in Evansville, which shows you that, they weren't spending the same budget that they did before. I mean, when we did Costa Rica, it took the UFC a long time, and they actually did it. But I could always say that they'd never done 12 fights 3 days in a row. And we did do that in Costa Rica, which is, just as a fun comment on that. The middle day was just screwy because, you got 36 fights, you got 72 fighters, entourage, everybody there. And, my signature's on all their contracts setting up the fight. So the middle day was post fight for the guys that fought the first day, fight day for the guys fighting that day, and weigh-in day for the guys fighting the next day. So it was chaos.
So You'll have to forgive me because so a little bit about myself that I didn't mention to you, and I don't know. I know I sent you YouTube links, et cetera, et cetera. But a brief summary about myself. I knew what MMA was. I knew what UFC was. I knew who the big guys, I guess you could say, the mid to late 2000s were, like Anderson, GSP, Mighty Mouse. Namely, those is as bad as that sounds. But I never, for like a better term, paid attention. I worked with a guy who trained. Shout out to George. He trained. He told me about Anderson and the weight cuts, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, it was like, I was a musician at the time. This was not something I paid attention to. I played the UFC games, as cornball as that is to say, on Xbox, et cetera. Excuse me. And then a friend of mine, Wes, shout out, invited me to go to a bar to watch UFC 229. Yes. Khabib versus Conor McGregor. I knew who Conor was. It was almost impossible at that time. If you were a living, breathing adult, Conor was almost a pop culture. I don't want to compare the two, but we can semi-call it how it is. He was almost on Michael Jordan level. Everybody knew who Conor was, just like everybody knew who Ronda was. I had never seen Conor fight. I heard about the Jose Aldo knockout. I heard about Ronda's run, knocking out or TKOing Bechkahea. Anyway, I never really paid attention to a full event. I had went to different bars to hang out with buddies for, like, I think it was a GSP, one of his title defenses, etc. Anyway, I had never gotten hardcore into it. But this specific night, I decided I'm going to pay attention and see what's shaking. I played the games. I understand the rule set, kind of. Let's pay attention. And there were some fights that night that were absolutely fantastic. And I was hooked. I have an addictive personality, and that is one of the things that really, really grabbed me. And from, we'll say, November, I watched a few more events. I watched DC versus Derek Lewis. What was the that was the next pay-per-view. And then I watched John Jones, Max Holloway versus Brian Ortega, Jones versus Gustafsson too. But in around that time, I bought UFC Fight Pass or subscribed to it and started delving deeper into the more, for lack of a better term, old school stuff. Started watching title runs. There's some more Pride stuff that I'd like to dig into. So yes, I'm definitely a more, at least in my mind, new school. But then there's a lot of guys that are like post-COVID watchers, and apparently I'm considered a semi-veteran, and I'm like, oh, that's weird for me to wrap my head around. But regardless, talking to dudes who've been into it and been into the other promotions that are essential to the history of the sport but may not be around anymore is always interesting to me. So Bodog, anyway, I digressed a lot. You mentioned Fedor.
Yeah.
I want to say that Jorge Masvidal fought for Bodog as well. Are there any other guys? Educate us. Who else? Is there any other names that stand out that were in Bodog?
Yeah. And a lot of I'll tell you this. A lot of people remember from that era the shows after we shut down that came immediately after, because there were, like Bodog, show people with some resources and doing big shows. Most people remember Strike Force. Most people remember Affliction, which was the shows that the T-shirt guys ran. Not to sound cocky, but my roster was the most dangerous roster to the UFC. So when we shut down, that gave them free reign to go ahead and crush the other shows, because the other shows didn't have the direction we did if we had been able to keep it going. So Fedor for Matt Lindland, if you remember Matt Lindland, at that time for the first champion we crowned was Eddie Alvarez, who also went on to be a Bellator champion and went on to be. I booked Eddie's first 15 fights probably, or 12 fights probably. I went to Eddie's wedding. So the first time Eddie went to Japan, we went together. So Eddie is probably, because he was UFC champion. We had another UFC champion, a guy named Cain Velasquez, who you may be familiar with. But Kane didn't fight for me a ton. I think he may have gotten 1 or 2 fights in for Bodog, but they were early in his career. But you could, there's some guys that jump out at you. Masvidal is a guy I probably booked his first 20 fights. So by the time we got to Bodog, he was a guy that I was very, very familiar with. And I booked his, and go ahead. I see you want to say
No,
something.
no. I was just saying, yeah, because Kane, I believe, and obviously don't hold me to it or quote me to it, but I want to say Kane was like 4-0, maybe 5-0 when the UFC signed him. He was very, very green, and for lack of a better term, on the professional MMA level,
Well,
and
the thing about
experienced.
Kane is Kane came from AKA, which is a major, producer of fighters. And when those guys, I've been told by dozens of people, my guy's going to be UFC champion again. Everybody says that about their guys. Not a lot make it, but the guys that handled Kane, they said it early on in his career that he'll be UFC champion, and he's a guy that backed it up. So not surprised he went to the UFC. Other big names from Bodog really fast. Just the other really big one crossover name is Chael Sonnen. Sonnen fought on every one of the Bodog cards that we did that was big. Roy Nelson, if you remember, Big Country. Big Country almost fought Fedor. He was one of the backups for it on the show when Lindland fought. So I consider that, we could go further into it. In terms of the women, a lot of the women pioneer fighters came from our show. We also had a good roster of fighters from Japan and Latin America and things like that. So we had a 200-man roster, which none of the other companies really got to that point. Maybe a little less than 200, but still we had a roster, not just show to show signing guys. And we had extended contracts and things. When I interviewed Chael for one of the podcasts that we do, I was very happy, obviously to get him now. He's a big star. So, yeah, but he remembered the contract that I gave him and he thanked me for it. And I'll tell you just as an insider, that was a point where Chael was still fighting for $2,000, trying to make it. And again, with him being under Couture, under Lindland and guys like that camp, he was lower on the pecking order, not getting a lot of fights, So when I signed him, again, you see the guy's got talent, obviously. So we got him. We were getting him for about 2,000 a fight. And when we signed him for Bodog, he got a 4-fight deal for 100,000, which was 25,000 a fight, flat fee. If you got a bonus, we'll figure it out. But you were going to get. So I didn't like to do that half and half, where you get double the money if you win, half if you lose, because every fighter thinks they're going to win, but then at the end you're faced with the realization of I lost. It's half the money. Shit. Now So I wanted to avoid that. I figured he got and Chael. If you look back at his Bodog run, he did those 4 fights in about a year. So I got him to be about making a little, maybe 14 months, but so he's making about 100,000 a year now. And now you can live at least. I'm not saying he's made a lot more money afterwards, right? But that was the very first start where he didn't have to go work or do anything like that. Masvidal got the same contract, by the way.
So what if you remember, if you don't remember, if you were to guess, like what like year span would this have been?
2007, 2008.
Oh yeah, well then 100,000 a year is, I mean, that's great money now, but then
Yeah,
beautiful.
keep in
Yes.
mind the fighters don't have it that easy because you got a manager, you got a trainer, everybody's taking
Yeah.
money. 100,000 is pre-taxes, so they figure that they gotta pay their taxes and stuff. But like I said, it's starting to seem more like a salary over the course of a year if you get your 4
Oh
fights
yeah.
in, as opposed to I made $2,000 3 times. I made $6,000 fighting this year. That's not something that they can live off of. They have to do something else. So that was a game changer for the guys that got the contract. Eddie had a little bigger contract because Eddie was Alvarez was the most spectacular ticket seller that we had before we got to Bodog, and we had to take care of this guy. So he had a
It-
little bit. I think he was making 30 per fight.
so obviously it didn't pan out, but there was, and we all know, especially hindsight being 2020, it was bullshit, right? Like it wasn't gonna happen. But I guess we're coming up on UFC 304. We just had 303, which was supposed to be Conor versus Chandler. There were some people, and it was a lot of social media posts, and then a lot of speculation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of Michael, obviously Conor pulls out because of a broken toe or whatever, and then Michael Chandler's like, "Hey, Dana," or I don't remember. I'm not even gonna get into that, so I'm not gonna say it. But essentially, there was some talk of the UFC needs to pull together a fight so they don't have a pullout on both sides for the main event, so they don't lose ticket sales. And there was a fight suggested, and obviously contractual issues, etc., probably mostly prevented this. But Michael Chandler versus Eddie Alvarez 3 was something that some people, I don't want to say teased, but bounced around in their heads. We know that they had two otherworldly, fantastic fights in
Yeah,
Bellator. So like, let's just play a game, if you will. We know where Chandler sits and his career up till he fought a year and some change ago. Oh shit, we're coming up on 2 years, I think, against Dustin at UFC 2. I'm not even gonna try to guess the number. Either way, Izzy versus Pereira 1 in MMA. And then the Conor stuff happened, Ultimate Fighter happened, etc. We know where Eddie Alvarez sits as far as leaving UFC and going over to One Championship and now in bare knuckle. So I guess, excuse me, as somebody, for lack of a better term, that was there for Chandler and Alvarez 1 and 2, or at least maybe not there, but you know what I'm saying. You
yeah.
were
And Eddie had
watching
left
then, working then.
Eddie had left Bodog, and so. But like I said, I went to his wedding. He's a guy I always followed, and I do agree with you. That run in Bellator, him and Chandler both. I don't want to say put Bellator on the map, but showed, and Eddie, by going over to win the UFC championship afterwards, showed that there were spots on Bellator's roster where the guys could compete at the UFC's level.
But if they were to fight like today, okay, like let's say hypothetically speaking, UFC 303 had somehow been headlined by Michael Chandler versus Eddie Alvarez 3, like where, with their prospective careers being where they are now, like I mean, I'm gonna just go ahead and assume that fight would be a dog fight once again, right? I mean,
Yeah, anytime companies put into like late replacements and stuff like that, it's difficult, and that would be a very interesting marquee matchup. I don't know if I was the matchmaker if I would have called Eddie, and Eddie's a friend of mine, but Eddie would have to be compensated well by the UFC for that. So if he was going to make a boatload of money, I'm sure you can get him out. Um, but to me, I'm not sure if you're aware, but he fought Mike Perry in bare knuckle, and
yeah.
watching that fight, I feel like Alvarez was up on the cards. And Alvarez chose not to come out for the third round because he was hurt. And that seemed to me to give me a sense of like, okay, Eddie's at the end, he's done. And if he doesn't feel that way, hey, it's obviously his decision. But being up on a guy, Mike Perry's at the top of the bare knuckle world. And if you look at the fight, I think it's arguable that Eddie could have been up on the judges' cards because Eddie was having a very, very good fight. But um, yeah, but he chose to not come out, and I think that was a sign. Um, and Chandler's been kind of chomping at the bit for a little bit, so you probably have to favor Chandler in the fight. It would be something marquee that they could do. Um, it's unfortunate that Conor had to pull out. Um, it ties into this weekend's UFC. Of I feel with Conor that the UFC really hasn't done a spectacular job of taking care of their asset there, making sure they have him, making sure he's motivated, because Conor's obviously motivated by money and now his businesses and his social media stuff, and he's blown up. As you mentioned it, he's like a Michael Jordan. He's the biggest star in MMA, and the richest. Dana, Joe Rogan, and him are the only guys who've gotten to 9 figures off of the sport, and he's the only fighter in that group, right? So I agree with
Yeah,
you with that,
yeah.
but
And
and he hasn't fought in a long time. So just to tell you what I would have done with him is, okay, if you're going to fight Chandler, you're going to fight Chandler. But this is the plan. You beat Chandler at 170. You go right into a title shot against Leon Edwards, and we do it in a football arena in England. And you can put John Jones and Aspinall on that card, and you've got perhaps the biggest UFC in history. I know they're going to do the Sphere, and Dana's pushing that. But what that would have done with Conor is would have put him back into almost the GOAT conversation. I'm not sure he belongs there. Like I have other people I like there, but he is a 2 division weight champion. And should he be how do you motivate a guy like that who's got everything at this point? Well, if we put you in with Leon Edwards, you now have a shot at being a 3 division world champion, which nobody's ever done. And we do it in England. You got Ireland versus England, and it'll be absolutely a blow-up fight. And I think that way you would maybe have him motivated to think, okay, there's a plan here and there's a second step, because you never got that, and that's where I think they actually dropped the ball by not having a plan for him, because the guy showed up in Las Vegas, no intent of joining USADA or anything like that. But hey, they invited him. He's going to go. Why not go to Vegas, hang out, and film the TV show, which we did. He did, and we all stupidly watched it. Like, yeah, they're going to fight. Meanwhile, there was never going to happen without the USADA stuff going down. And that showed me there's no plan there for him. So that plan that I just laid out for you, I'm not saying he wouldn't have broken his toe. And obviously Leon's got to get by Aspinall now. But I'm sorry, not Aspinall, Bilal Muhammad now, you know. But assuming that Leon is able to win that fight, now there's a good chance for you. Leon's actually getting to the point where he's defended the belt a few times. He's getting to be a champion with pedigree. If he gets by Muhammad, it's almost like, and he waited a long time for his title shot, right? So here's a great way to reward him. Give him a spot in the biggest fight in UFC history against McGregor. Now you've got both guys motivated. Now you've got a plan that lays out, and by the end of the year, we could have maybe seen that. And then if you combine it with Jones and Aspinall, they might split them up. But if you wanted to fill up a 90,000 seat arena in England, put both of those fights together.
Yeah, and I know that you had mentioned pre-recording about like thoughts of Leon Edwards and like moving forward or something to that extent. So obviously that's could have been, if you will, right?
Yeah.
So here we are, 3 days, right? Essentially. Yeah. From Saturday, where he's going to be in Manchester fighting Bilal Muhammad. So how do you see that one going? Because I definitely have my opinion. How do you see it?
I think Leon's a guy that I would favor Leon in the fight. Like, I like Muhammad's game, and obviously he's gotten himself to a title shot. There's talent there and everything there, but I think that Leon still is hungry, and that has to do a little bit with the disrespect that I feel the UFC has shown him, even as champion, where they haven't really taken care of him. They put him on the shelf. He's waited for a long time for the championship belt, and you've got Dana White on record saying Kamaru Usman is the greatest welterweight that they've ever seen, and he's 2-1 against him. And he still hasn't gotten a heavy promotional push or the respect. Maybe he's gotten some of the money that the champion should be getting, but at the same time, without the notoriety, without that, Conor was getting all the headlines, not Leon. So I think that makes him hungry, and I think that gives us an opportunity to see him perform this weekend. And like I said, if he wins, and the UFC hears this, I don't think they listen to me much, you know what I mean? But they could still rush Conor into a title shot. I mean, they do control who gets the title shots, and they could cut everybody in the division off and make that fight. And in terms of marquee and money value, um, I think I've hit on what would be the biggest fight that the UFC could do right now, and that is rush Conor into the third division, world title shot, motivate Conor so that he doesn't break his toe. What's funny is I don't know how much history you want to go into, but really quickly, and there was some clips on this on the internet recently, kind of pointing it out. But when Conor fought Nate Diaz the first time, if you remember, Nate was a late replacement for Rafael dos Anjos. Okay, and dos Anjos messed his foot up, just like Conor. And somebody recently sent me a picture of what dos Anjos' foot looked like when he pulled out of that fight. And also Conor talking about, hey, just put some ice on it. What are you doing? You didn't want to fight and stuff like that. And if you compare what his foot looked like to Conor's little pinky toe, being a little purple, Conor should have put some ice on it and done what he said the other guy should do 10 years ago. But that's where not having a plan and Conor being all over the place, his edge may be wearing off a little bit. But like I said, if the UFC wanted to cash in, I think I've just told you what would be the biggest way for them to cash money in with Conor.
Now, let me ask you this, and then I have another UFC 304 question. So, like you said, the UFC are the matchmakers, right? They're no matter what the champ says in a weight class, the UFC is the decision maker, right? Like what they want to happen pretty much will happen. Look at a guy like Francis Ngannou, put his foot down, didn't pan out so well for him, unfortunately. And I'm sure, not thinking too hard on it, but I'm sure relatively similar situations have happened in the past. But if Conor came in and beat Michael Chandler, even if it was at 170 or any lightweight, or really realistically, let's be honest with ourselves, anybody, 55 or 70, whether he beat them at 170 or 55, if that makes sense, whatever Conor wants or the UFC wants, pretty much going to happen, especially if he does it in with style points, right? So if he came in to beat Chandler at 170 and just starches him in the first or second or any round, really, I think Conor, the UFC would play the game of, well, we'll put Conor at 170, or I could see them putting him at 155, even though the Chandler fight was set to be at 170. So out of the two champs at those two weight classes, you have Islam Makhachev, you have Leon Edwards. I think both of them are fantastic. I think Leon is very deserving of being, I think he's currently number 3 or number 4 on the pound for pound rankings. At least for me, he's definitely top 4.
Yep.
I think Leon is definitely, people can say what they want about his style or whatever they want to point out. Leon's fantastic. I do have Islam at number 1 pound for pound right now. But I guess what I'm getting at is, out of those two matchups, which one do you feel would be more favorable or winnable for Conor?
I think that you also have to keep in mind that the UFC is motivated primarily by money. And I think that the Edwards McGregor fight would be definitely bigger money than Makhachev McGregor. Even though you got the Khabib tie-in, and they probably would have to do that in Abu Dhabi, which it's not a bad trip. Or maybe they go to Saudi Arabia with it, where the Arabs are throwing around a lot of money and stuff. But I think 90,000 seat arena in London, something that Anthony Joshua did in boxing recently, and think Tyson Fury, that those kind of guys do that. You put Conor in that situation, and he will sell that arena out. So, and I think him and Leon might be a more crowd pleasing fight. I think Islam does have that tendency. He'll Islam will just ground Conor and wrestle, and that's okay. The UFC may have made a decision to not put Conor in the title picture anymore. It behooves them, especially depending on how many fights he has left in his contract. They may not want to put him in the title picture anymore. But like I mentioned, I'm just talking about how they could generate the most money. I think that what that plan is, him and Leon would be the biggest generator of money that's in the foreseeable future, bigger than John Jones's comeback.
So, 100% with you on that. So another fight that you mentioned, tying in with that one, which pertains to this weekend as well, is old Tom Aspinall, right, versus John Jones, hypothetically, right? So, what do you think about the fight this weekend? Because the odds are, in my opinion, far too wide. He's like a -3 or -400 on some books, favorite over Curtis Blades. Like, what is your, I guess, thoughts on this weekend's fight? And then, hypothetically speaking, let's say he just looks absolutely fantastic. What are your thoughts on a potential matchup between him and John Jones? And
Well, I think the problem with Jones is that they spent a lot of time, and we talked about Leon Edwards maybe not getting the respect he deserves as a champion. We'll bring up another guy who they showed no respect to, and that's Stipe. So now you've got Stipe and Jones as like a potential super fight and stuff like that. To be honest with you, if I were Stipe, I would tell him to go scratch at this point. Unless they want to give me $15 million or something like that, I would tell him to go scratch, because it's been a lot of disrespect. He already deserved rematches. They shelled him at times like that. And he's also, Stipe, by all accounts, is a good man. He's working. He's got his job. I'm sure that he's not a guy that blew all his UFC money. So I'm not sure that money motivates him anymore. And, how do you get up for a fight that they've talked about for a couple of years now and not made happen? So if Stipe is out of the picture, Aspinall and Jones becomes the big marquee match. And again, Jones is the other guy that they may say, Jones and Conor headline two different shows, and that way we monetize two different shows. But I think that it's been a while since they did something huge in the English market. And I think that the English economy and market is a place that opens itself to something big like that. And so combining them, you put them in a 90,000 seat arena. Now the UFC's done something they've never done before. And Aspinall, I think, can hold up his end of the bargain. I think he'll beat Curtis. I'm not sure. I'm not sure the odds are not disrespectful to Curtis. You know what I mean? But that's one of the reasons that the British market should be something that the UFC is paying a little bit better attention to, because you've got rabid fans there. You've got fans that bet. So why are the odds so wide? Because money's coming in on Aspinall. That's why. I think Aspinall and Jones, we'll see. Jones might wipe him out because, Jones is considered the GOAT by many. Very rarely challenged in many of his earlier fights. We haven't seen much of him at heavyweight, although he wiped out, what's the name of the French fighter?
Sorogan.
Yeah, exactly. But, there's still that aspect of I want to see more of Jones at heavyweight. And, he's another guy that has spent, like Conor and these guys, they will one day lament having blown years out of their prime not fighting.
So to play, I don't want to say devil's advocate, but just to, I guess, lay out some facts, if you will, right? So John Jones became the youngest UFC champion at 23, right? And the light heavyweight division was the UFC's marquee division. I think it's lightweight now, but at one point it was a marquee division. I mean, you had so many top tier guys. You had Tito Ortiz, Chuck Liddell, Rashad Evans, Rampage Jackson, uh, Lyoto Machida, Shogun Hua. Which one of the Shamrocks was a light heavyweight? Was it Ken or?
Well, this time period, those guys predate that a little bit because neither of the Shamrocks was really from the Dana White era, So,
Right.
but yeah, you're right. That was the weight class with the most pedigree.
But when Jones came into it, right, you still had guys like Rashad Evans and Lyoto Machida and Shogun Hua. Rampage was still there. Trying to think of some of the other guys. Those were the main four, I guess, that you could say were active, former champions, right? But when you compare John Jones to those guys, there were so many physical attributes that he had advantage wise over those guys. He was massive height wise, 2 to 3 inches, and then you look at wingspan / reach, absurd, right? And it wasn't till later into his career. I mean, he had the first Gustafsson fight where he had I guess that'd be Gus was like a 79, so 5.5-inch reach advantage. Still a huge reach advantage, but not as absurd as being 84.5 compared to say 72 or 74 inches, right? The light heavyweights seem to become more athletic. They seem to be more matching to him as far as physical attributes. I know Dominic Reyes isn't the greatest punch taker these days. The dude's huge. He's 6'4", I believe, with a 78 or 77-inch reach.
Johnny Walker, is a huge, massive guy.
But when you look at the guys, so Jones obviously gets all his issues. I think that was the arrest or the one of the two. It was either the arrest or the suspension that led him to being on hiatus, if you will. He comes back at UFC 232 against, let's be honest, the shell of Alexander Gustafsson, finishes him in the second round via TKO on the ground. Then he goes on to fight Anthony Smith, where he loses the first round. Anthony Smith may have been a middleweight, but he's a big dude. He's 6'4", 76-inch reach. Then he goes on at UFC 230, 38 or 39, and fights Thiago Santos, who's another former middleweight, moved up, big middleweight, 6'2", with a 76 or 77-inch reach. Very, very close fight, where Thiago Santos fights him with basically no knees. Then he fights against Dominic Reyes and has, even though the only time he's ever won, this is what's crazy. The Gustafsson fight is arguably the closest, and then there's some people that think the Reyes fight is most definitely arguably the closest. But the only time that he has had a split decision loss was actually against Thiago Santos. But the common thread there is 3 younger guys that can match him physically. Now, Cyril Gane's a young guy that matches him physically. Sometimes I wonder about Cyril Gane, but in a roundabout way, I guess is what I'm getting at. And this isn't to discredit Jones, his skill set, his talent level, his title run, his entire run. But Tom Aspinall matches him in so many aspects, save for the fact that we don't know what he looks like past basically 2.5 rounds outside the UFC. And 2.5 rounds inside the UFC. I think his longest fight was Andrei Arlovsky. But if you think about physical specimens, a guy that can match him, obviously, John Jones was never the hardest hitter, so Tom Aspinall just wipes him there. I think Tom Aspinall is a better striker for them, depending on how you define better.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the ground, they're relatively even. So I just wonder, I guess what I'm getting at in a roundabout way is, let's just say that the Stipe fight never happens. Or even if it does, let's just say it does and John Jones wins. Do you think that John Jones is willing to risk in my opinion, I don't want to say risk legacy because it doesn't discredit what he's done up to this point. It doesn't make it like, oh, John Jones is a bum, a fraud the entire time. But do you think he's willing to risk that record of whatever he's at now, 24-1-0 or 24-1-1, I should say, or 23, whatever it is, 25? Is it worth him risking taking a true L against Tom Aspinall, or do you think Jones is, I guess you could say, too smart for that? I don't want to say scared, but too smart to be like, let's get this Stipe win and let's ride into the sunset. And then I'll even add this asterisk to it. Let's just say that Tom Aspinall cannot put Curtis Blades away in a round and a half or a round or any round, and he does get tired. What happens if Tom Aspinall gets into the third round, the fourth round, the fifth round? Curtis Blades slows down a bit, but he's been there, done that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say Curtis Blades does beat John Jones, be it decision or finish. Does John Jones even stick around to fight Curtis Blades? Because that's a fight, even before the Cyril Gane fight, that I thought, this is an interesting matchup for John Jones. I know I went a little long-winded there, but
yeah,
there's a lot of things.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think you touched on. There are a couple of things here. So, one of the things I noticed as fighters come up and their pay improves, that nobody ever wants to make less money, from one fight to the next. So that's the thing about Jones would be motivation. And now once you get Jones with the idea, for example, that we're going to do a 90,000 seat arena in England, and you'll be compensated, based on the size of the event, then I think that you can definitely see him taking the fight with Aspinall.
You do think 90,000 seats, huge paycheck, doesn't matter the risk. Let's say Aspinall goes out there and starches Curtis Blades in 35 seconds, and then John Jones goes out and has a life and death split decision, 48-47 against Stipe Miocic. You could still see money being enough to draw John Jones into what I consider at this point a very, very, very dangerous fight.
Yeah, I see. Everything I know about Jones, I don't know Jones personally. But everything I know about Jones is that he very much you have an ego there. So I think, despite the fact that you have a good analysis of Aspinall, and I agree with you that kind of like Leon Edwards now, the British guys, you say he's I think he's a better boxer than John. I'm not sure striker once you consider elbows, knees, and some of the sophistication that Jones has shown. But definitely a better boxer. So it's interesting when a fighter can bring something to the table against a guy like Jones, where he does have a skill set where he's better than him at. So I think that would cause John some pause, but I think John is also a guy who at times takes something like that. If he starts hearing people say, Aspinall's a better boxer, Aspinall's a better boxer, his ego reacts with like, okay, I'm going to prove them wrong. That helps. The money helps, and something motivational like that for his locker room and stuff, so that he's coming in for the fight. Jones has shown that kind of motivation before. So yeah, I think it is a worry. But riding off into the sunset, I think he still has some other things that he might want to prove. The riding off into the sunset and then coming back and doing a fight, 3 years after retiring and, making a comeback and stuff like that doesn't sound as appealing as going from a Stipe Classic fight into the biggest fight in the biggest stadium that the UFC's ever done, against a worthy opponent. I think you can get Jones. Like I said, there is some art to the motivating of the fighters, and you gotta have. I think with the size of their roster and stuff, and the UFC basically gets what they want most of the time. They may have lost some of that with these guys, and you see that also with them sitting out and spending long periods of time out of the ring. How especially with your big cash guys, why do you do that? Why would you not be using these guys? So, long and short of it is, I think if properly motivated, Jones would come in and do the fight for sure.
So I guess you could say tailing off of that, right? So we look at the Jones resume and the two weight champ, and we can say what we want, I guess, the asterisk, because I don't want to say there's an asterisk over the Cyril Gane win, but I think on the feet John Jones did look a little slow, right? And Cyril Gane has obviously shown that maybe defensive wrestling isn't his greatest asset. But I think,
Yeah,
I guess what I'm
there-
getting at is I have
Yep.
two different definitions. I have a definition where I say the greatest of all time and the best of all time. To me, greatest is accolades. What have you done for me? And then best is overall skill set. So John Jones by many is considered the GOAT, right? You've been around for a long time. You've seen a lot of guys. You've met a lot of guys. If you were to break down to 5, and I always hate doing this because everybody has their different opinions and their credentials, but if you were to go by accolades, not just accolades, but I guess accolades with a little bit of skill set sprinkled in, who would be your 5 on the GOAT list? And then on the opposite side of that, let's accolade skill set with a little bit of accolades sprinkled in, if that
Okay.
makes sense, right?
I'm going to ramble
I'm
a
just
little
curious,
bit just
who
to
would
give
be
you a
your
little
5?
background. So first off, in boxing, we had Mayweather in our lifetimes, right? And he was clearly the number one rated guy and things like that. And when he retired, I'm not sure if you follow boxing or if you remember, but the guy who became the number one pound for pound guy on the planet was a guy named Chocolatito. He's a Nicaraguan fighter who fights in the 118, 122 pound weight classes. The situation there is that I talked to a few boxers and people like that, and they discredited him a little bit because at the lower weight classes, those guys just do lack getting respect in many ways. That said, the best skill set that we've ever seen in this sport is Demetrius Johnson.
I thought that's where you were going with it.
I remember in the early days of the sport that the lighter guys have had a pace and an ability. They just are able to do more than the heavyweights and things. Obviously, the power of the heavyweights and the thing I always say is, these 125 like Demetrius Johnson. It does look weird in a press conference when the ring girls are bigger than him. You know what I mean? That's just for the mass audience. You know what I mean? But Demetrius is the best skill set we've ever seen. His accolades and the rewards and stuff are not there for him because of the other reasons I just mentioned. To me, the pound for pound best is Fedor. I know Dana doesn't credit Fedor and doesn't like it, and that has to do a little bit because he was never able to sign him. Dana's just wrong. He's just simply wrong, and not too many people would say that to his face or anything like that. But I don't have a problem putting Fedor number one. Fedor's running pride is unbelievable. Fedor fought everybody. The Nogueira fights, the Crow Cop fights. He fought. I'm not going to remember his exact name, but a Korean guy that was practically double his size. You can't compare those types of challenges to fighting in your weight class the same way. So Fedor had the most diverse ability against the most diverse competition that we've seen in the sport, and that's why I would place him ahead of Jones. Prime Fedor against Prime Jones is a pick'em fight. And Jones is spectacular also, but I think Jones has different than Fedor. Jones does have a little bit of a self-destructive side to him. You know what I mean? Just talking with the boys here, kind of thing. Jones, what was he doing at 1 a.m. in New Mexico, driving around in leotards? You know what I mean? It's like I think there may have been some drug use or who knows what was going on there where Fedor doesn't do shit like that, and he never did. Fedor was a guy who was very focused, and I think that matters. So right there, you've got Fedor, Jones, Demetrius. I would probably put Anderson Silva in that group because Anderson just did some spectacular things. In outside the UFC and in the UFC, and he had a long run of fights. And his run as a prime fighter was also spectacular. For accomplishments, you could go at number 5 in that group in a lot of different directions. For a guy that just put together enjoyable, great fights, gritty, a guy that if you were in a ditch in World War I fighting, I might put Dan Henderson there. Because he didn't win a UFC title. Anderson wiped him out, and that was an unexpected fight. But everything else the guy was a machine. Longevity. Also a guy who fought at middleweight, fought at light heavyweight, and also fought at heavyweight.
I mean, he did old Fedor pretty
Yep.
dirty. Talk about an instant change of pace.
Yeah.
Right.
The thing about
That's a
that
wild
is,
one.
Fedor at some point you noticed a drop off in Fedor. He fought a little bit beyond his prime. That is a black mark on his legacy. But again, just judging by his Pride run and the run that he had at his maximum, I would still put him at number 1. And beating Fedor is one of the things that made Henderson move maybe into the top 5 in my book. There are other guys that you could probably mention there, but I like to mention Dan because not a lot of people talk about him in that way. And maybe we can push some recognition. Go back and look at the guy's career. He fought his first fights. He goes to Brazil and fights in full out NHB with headbutts and no gloves and that sort of stuff. And so yeah, that's my top 5.
It's a great top 5. Dan Hendo is definitely somebody that is undervalued and underappreciated. I don't know if I would have him on my top 5, but I will tell you this: one of my favorite fights of all time, 2 of my favorite fights of all time, actually. No. I'm sorry. 1. Got ahead of myself. One of my favorite fights of all time actually features Henderson, and that is, like, shocker here, Henderson versus Shogun Rua 1 in the UFC. I'm trying to remember the event number. I don't know why I wanted to say he was in 2 of them. I was thinking of a different fight, which is another fantastic one. It's a heavyweight fight, which was Bigfoot Silva versus Mark Hunt. Fantastic fight. I'm definitely a place that I, for lack of a better term, lack in as far as recall and memory and viewing history, if you will, is Pride. I've went and watched several Pride fights, right? But a lot of my stuff has been UFC. And then you were mentioning Anderson, and it's funny you said pre UFC, right? Like leading up, he had a 17 fight win streak, because Kamaru Usman was 1 fight shy of tying the 17, and it's like the Anderson curse, because there's somebody else that was really close to catching an Anderson record. I don't remember which one it was, but they didn't do it, right? But I know when we talk about like Anderson, and Anderson is one of those guys that just seem to be have who was it you mentioned earlier? I don't remember, but you mentioned the term aura, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anderson, I was there for it, but I wasn't, right? I knew who he was. I heard the name. I heard about the fights, but I didn't watch, right? But going back and watching the tape, the dude seemed to have people beaten before they even stepped into the cage or the ring pre-UFC, right? A lot of the knockouts that people love of his are like, or when they think of Anderson, they think of the Vitor Belfort front kick or the masterclass against Forrest Griffin. But one of my favorite Anderson knockouts is actually pre-UFC. I think it was the last fight he had pre-UFC, and it was in Cage Rage, I believe, against Tony Franklin, the up elbow.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what?
Yeah, no,
Like how? He just
he and Fedor share that when they were in their high moments, the confidence that they brought and the ability to execute that they fought at is unparalleled. Anderson, I always remember against Weidman when he got caught. Maybe he was starting to slow down physically a little bit, and he wasn't able to get out of the way. Whereas the last fight, he was able to get out of the way. You know what I mean? But there are times I think it may have been against Stefan Bonner where they're exchanging and Bonner's maybe moving a little slower or whatever. So he would put himself up. He'd be like rearranging where it's like, okay, I'm going to go over here against the cage. Come and fight me. Come and fight me. And he's just waiting and taunting people. And everything he did was all not arrogant because it was confidence because he could back it up. And that's what was crazy. To me, I haven't laughed so hard at a UFC event than when Nick Diaz lay down in front of him. And Nate is a guy that could match him with the mind games. But when Forrest, I've interviewed Forrest Griffin, and Forrest talks about the level of excellence that he faced that day, and with unbelievable respect. So yeah.
What's funny about that one is you go back and watch it, right? I'm trying to remember who did Anderson. I was it Demian Maya that he fought before Forrest, or was it how do you say his name? Thales Litis?
Yeah.
It was one of the two that he fought. He fought one of those two before he fought Forrest, and then he had another one of those two. I don't remember which one that he fought before he fought Future Belfort. So it was both instances, which are considered to be his two of his. I don't want to say defining, but legendary classic moments where he was riding from a crowd's perspective a low against Forrest Griffin when they announcing Anderson. This fight, the crowd is booing and he's kind of wide eye and laughing like, oh God. And then he comes out and just absolutely the knockout of that fight is great, but to me, that's one of the great masterclass performances that you will ever see. It was doing this and then just hands down dodging shots. There's been other guys that have dodged shots, but that one is on a showmanship and from technical perspective, just phenomenal, just beautiful, right? But like, let me ask you this. This is something else that hit me a second ago. So we're talking about these guys, right? We're talking about Anderson. We're talking about Fader, right? Another guy that's or another two guys that stand at the top of the list when people talk about GOATs, right? And of course these are, what's the term I'm looking for? I don't want to call them UFC shills, but guys like myself that are primarily post Pride and post Strikeforce. You have GSP and you have Jose Aldo, right? And those guys are often dubbed as the greatest their weight classes have ever seen. GSP 170 respectively, 145 for Aldo, right? And then you mentioned it earlier, Dana talking about Kamaru Usman potentially being the 170 GOAT. And then there's the conversations of Volkanovski and Max Holloway being in contention for GOAT at 145. And the common, I guess you could say, backlash / asterisk, if you will, of those arguments against GSP and Jose Aldo respectively is when you look at the time that those guys were champs or became champs. I know Jose Aldo was automatically made the UFC 145 champ because the UFC absorbed WEC. You look at those dudes and how quickly, if you will, they got the titles. So Jose Aldo automatically got bumped up to it. And then GSP, I know he got it, then he lost it, then who did he beat? He beat somebody, then beat Matt Serra to get it back. Or no, I'm not even going to try to remember. Regardless, my opinion is, I'm not going to say easier, but it was a quicker route to the title when those two guys were title holders And I think maybe it's due to size of roster, and maybe it's due to level of excitement. Like Kamaru wasn't, well, even though a lot of people consider GSP to be a boring champ. I guess what I'm getting at is, in a roundabout way, is what is your opinion when we compare the two? We compare Kamaru. Let's compare Kamaru to GSP, and let's compare Alexander Volkanovski to Jose Aldo. Jose Aldo being automatically promoted or crowned as the UFC 145 champ, and Volkanovski, I want to say he was, God, I don't want to say 7-0. I should have looked at this number before getting his title shot against Max. And then Kamaru was, I think, 9-0 or 10-0 before getting his title shot against Tyron Woodley. So these guys obviously had longer runs, namely Kamaru Usman, before getting their title shots. And I know, well, these guys had more title fights, but they had a shorter run. So who's to say that Kamaru Usman, if he had two or three non-title fights before he got a title shot and won the title, who's to say that he wouldn't have had that run? So I guess what I'm getting at is, what is your opinion comparatively as far as ease in quotation, ease to the title as compared to guys now where they have to fight so much longer before getting that title shot?
Then you take the case of Pereira, who didn't have to. That they still kind of rushed into there. Pereira's another guy that maybe if he goes to heavyweight can make things interesting. We could talk about that. And you talk about guys like Cody Garbrandt, who they also sort of, he won the title, but he won it like in his 10th fight overall. And I think guys, especially in the case of Cody Garbrandt, that they rushed him. So the pace, I think, has to do with the UFC deciding who they can cash in on best. And Usman is not really the marquee value guy. During that time period, they clearly liked Adesanya more. And if you look at it, Adesanya was more of a social media person and a talker and things like that, whereas Usman's more, go about his business kind of thing. And all they really know how to market is, kind of these, big personality guys like a Conor or things like that. Usman, to me, is like a role model type champion, just like GSP was. Whereas, like,
Yep.
if you choose to market certain other aspects of it, if you were more creative, then maybe you get bigger stars out of it. But that's neither here nor there. To me, the thing about GSP and what puts him in the GOAT conversation is that I just recently interviewed a Canadian MMA promoter named Pete Rodley, and he met GSP when he was 16 years old. GSP was, he had hair and like a bowl haircut, and GSP showed up at the shows with his father. His father took him. And he spoke very little English. They're French Canadians, right? The father also didn't speak great English, but and he said to me, the first words GSP said to him ever at 16 years old was, "I want to be one of your warriors." And he comes out and he did his first fights in Canada and UCC. He was one of those first guys that grew up with this as a sport, not. And the other thing with his remarkable focus and things like that to me is his wrestling was spectacular. But he wasn't a wrestler. It's like Matt Hughes' wrestling was spectacular, but Matt Hughes wrestled his whole life. GSP didn't wrestle as in his youth and stuff like that. So that's what made GSP special was the focus and that athleticism. I think what knocks him out of my top five is that maybe the same thing with Usman is that they had a little bit more of a safe style to win and took maybe less risks, and therefore maybe in certain fights they're considered to be less crowd pleasing, But that's really the only bad thing you can say about GSP. He obviously belongs in a conversation of all time greats. Usman, I wouldn't put him on GSP's level. I feel like GSP's run and then losing to Sarah and then coming back and showing that is something that you you got to credit also. Not everybody has a perfect record among the guys that we're talking about, and that's because of what I just mentioned is risk taking. And you mentioned, Will Jones risk fighting Aspinall. The top guys don't think that way, and GSP didn't. So that's why I would rate GSP as, and I'm not a huge GSP fan. I just left him out of my top five, but I would rate him a little bit ahead of Usman on the all-time great list.
Now, oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I
I
was
didn't
just
mean to
gonna,
interrupt you.
if you want, with Aldo, I think Aldo is a little bit of a different story because at 145, I think he still is the guy that we've seen with the most diverse and interesting skill set. Holloway's obviously a super crowd pleaser, and Holloway's right there with him. Aldo, unfortunately, ran into McGregor on the rise, and he lost that fight, you know, before they got in the ring. Conor was in his
13
head.
seconds.
Conor was way in his head. And he made a mistake that the Jose Aldo of the previous fights would never make. Rush in like that against a guy who's probably his most forefront best talent is in Conor is his precision punching. So he made it extremely easy, obviously, and I think that's because he had lost the head games before that. But go down another weight class, and around that era, you had another guy who, talent was through the ceiling, but then something happened in his career, and the wheels came off. But that another guy that you might want to put maybe in the top 15 is Renan Barao.
I was getting ready to say Hannon.
So you have a lot of good examples of it doesn't last for everybody forever, and the sport's littered with guys with nice runs and things like that. We've been talking about the cream of the crop guys, but yeah, there have been a lot of guys that fascinated the sport for a short period of time. Cody Garbrandt's a guy that did that, another guy with a world of talent. You want to talk about talent until he got older, and he's another guy who suffered huge injuries. But Dominic Cruz, and again, now once you get to the lower weight classes, you start talking about the wide range of skills that they show over the other weight classes.
So I have two things that I want to touch on before closing, and then I want to talk to you again at another time because there's so much stuff I want to delve into, but we're coming close on time. But two things I want to touch on. One, since it's the last thing you said, we were talking about Cruz, right, and Renan Barao, which first off, or actually a number of things. Cody Garbrandt, you mentioned him twice. This is more of a statement thing. What a fall from grace. And I mean that with no disrespect. You talk about a guy that was on a rise that put on a master class, to me, one of the greatest title fight performances, just pristine against Dominic Cruz. Drops TJ Dillashaw in his first title defense, gives him the old bird. Unfortunately, gets finished. Puts up a decent fight against Dillashaw a second time. Gets finished. Comes back against, his next fight was Pedro Munoz. Gets finished. I believe the next fight was against Rafael Assunção. One of my favorite knockouts ever at the bell of the second round. Yes, second round. Either way, you talk about a guy that just had this huge climb, beats arguably the best weight classes ever seen in Dominic Cruz. It's debatable between him and Dillashaw, in my opinion. And then you talk about a huge, huge dive. Unfortunate as hell. And then we're talking about 35, and we mentioned Dominic Cruz. Obviously, touched on Dillashaw. But here's a question I have regarding 135 pounds. We're talking about accolades and who fights who and performance level, right? There seems to be this huge opinion or take or mindset, however you want to look at it, that Aljamain Sterling is the greatest 135-pound fighter of all time. Now, I'm curious to know your opinion, but I've definitely got my opinion. So I'm going to let you go first before I
Yeah, no,
possibly rain on the parade.
I think Aljamain is a guy that could one day be there. I think he's talented. I think that in his title win and coming back to seal, which was controversial because of the way he won the belt, and then him coming back and kind of doing what Conor does and playing a fantastic mind game, so that people were, picking against him and stuff like that, and he dominated. I think he's shown that he may have what it takes. I don't like the jump from 135 to 145 for a lot of guys. So we'll see how he performs at this weight class on a longer period. I think, Cody kind of reminds me of Chuck Liddell. The difference there, though, is that Chuck was a guy whose run lasted a lot longer. So
Yeah.
Chuck is a guy that sometimes gets into these conversations also as one of the greatest runs of the sport in his heyday. But then he went out with some of the ugliest knockouts that you've ever seen as well. It just caught up to Cody a little faster. And I think the problem with Cody is that they rushed him into the championship picture, that he, won the belt. Now, how do you adjust in your mind? Because then it's all straight top guys. There was not like a down fight or bring him back or, give him some ease or anything like that. He was always in there against the top competition. At some point, I would have match made him different and try to extend his career a little longer, because I at the end of the day, um, they didn't get enough fights out of Cody, for his career either. I'm sure that his bank account, he's going to at some point say, I wish I'd gotten half dozen more fights in at the mid to top level, but, take home even that might be 5, 6 more fights, might be at the low end, $500,000 more for him, on career income. That makes a difference when guys start to leave the sport and retire and stuff. So, the UFC is a machine, but there are instances like, I think Cody Garbrandt's a guy that they handle poorly. We've talked about Stipe being handled poorly. We've talked about Leon being handled poorly. They do drop the ball every once in a while, in that they themselves didn't maximize what they could have gotten out of those guys. So we'll see how Aljamain continues. He's obviously very, very talented. It's fun. He comes from the CFFC. It shows up in the Northeast, and I'm pretty good friends with their matchmaker, Arias. So we've talked about Aljamain a lot, and they always thought, I mentioned really early in this podcast, where you hear from a lot of people, hey, we got a guy with championship potential. Well, Arias firmly believed he had championship potential in Aljamain from the beginning as well. So definitely a guy who may be in that conversation. He's just not quite there yet in my book.
So I say here's my, I don't want to say counter argument to you per se, but counter argument to the whole 135 GOAT discussion for him. So if you were to ask me my top 5 135 GOATs, especially on a UFC level, right? Like if we're going by UFC explicitly, I'm going to go TJ Dillashaw, Dominic Cruz, maybe Renan Barão, maybe Aljamain Sterling. We can do a flip flop between those two for 3 and 4, and then Cody Garbrandt. Now, here's why I don't have Aljo at number 1. Since the Corey Sandhagen win, which was beautiful, right? Every win he's had since then at 35 had an asterisk. Okay, so Petr Yan loses the first round, wins the second round, and is on his way, basically. I don't want to say out, but it wasn't looking too good. And then Petr Yan lands an illegal knee. that's a bit of Petr Yan and a bit of his corners. Mostly Petr Yan. I think his corner said don't do it, but he did it regardless. Out of Aljo's hands. That one I always like to argue a little bit because we automatically are going to do a disqualification win, where we look shortly thereafter having Juan Espino versus Alexander Romanov, where a similar situation happened. Romanov said he couldn't fight. We went to the scorecards, did the point deduction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then it goes to Romanov. If they had done a point deduction in round 4 for the knee and then went to the scorecards, Jan would have won. That's another one. It's like what happened to Petr Yan after that, but I digress. So gets the title fight on a huge, or gets the belt on a huge asterisk. He comes back against Petr Yan in their second fight. When I watched it, I thought Aljo was gonna win, even though I saw path to victory / okay, let me rephrase that. I thought Petr would win going into it, but upon watching the fight as it was happening, I thought it was going to be Aljo's fight, but I could see where maybe it should have been Petr's. Regardless, little asterisk, close fight. Second title defense against TJ Dillashaw. Huge asterisk there. Dillashaw coming off of being inactive, fights Corey Sandhagen in a very, very debatable win. I actually, upon rewatching, think that the judges got it right. TJ Dillashaw did win, but inactive, and then a bad shoulder. Shoulder continued to pop out. His shoulder's still horrendous. He's had multiple surgeries. So I'm not saying that a healthy Dillashaw would have won, but that's a huge asterisk being so unhealthy and so injured. And then Henry Cejudo off of a 3-year layoff. And yes, I think he won, but it was very, very debatable. It was close. It was too close for comfort. And then he loses to Sean O'Malley via knockout in the second round. And I mean, I'm not going to hold the Sean O'Malley one against him, but I have a hard time crowning somebody as the greatest that a weight class has ever seen when every title defense that they've had has had in my opinion, very a clear or large asterisk next to it, where guys like Dillashaw and Cruz did not. That's all I'm going to add to that. And then before we go, and I definitely want to talk to you more, but we were talking about 145 earlier, a fight that's being discussed, rumored. Can't believe all the rumors, but this one, I do wonder how accurate it is, and I think it might be very accurate, be it this event that I'm going to name or another event, is Max Holloway challenging Ilia Topuria for the 145 belt. What are you thinking about that one? What do you think of Ilia Topuria? Because me personally, I wasn't high on him. I wasn't even that high on him, as crazy as it sounds. After the Bryce Mitchell fight, it was when he fought Josh Emmett. I thought, damn, this dude's a fucking problem.
Yeah.
And then he knocked out Volkanovski. So what do you think? What do you think about him, and what do you think about him versus Holloway?
I think he's a guy that they may have gotten it right with. I don't think he's got a ton of fights, but he's not in the Cody Garbrandt championship fight in his 9th fight or 10th fight or whatever. I think he's got just enough, and I think he's got that. I know he's from Spain, is where he lives, but he's Georgian originally, and I think that the Eastern European guys come with a bit of mental toughness too, that I like his displays of confidence. So I am very interested to see if he is able to stick and blossom with his potential. In terms of Max, Max has done nothing but make me look bad, picking against him sometimes here and there and stuff. And the guy's obviously proven himself to be also an all-time great in the weight class. I don't want to harp on something negative, and it's been a long time, but he was pulled out of a fight. I think it may have even been with Khabib, but he was pulled out of a fight because of what looked to be some neurological problems, where in the weight cutting and things like that. And I hate when those types of things are in a fighter's history because you never know when they can pop up again. And he's been in a lot of hard fights since. There's been talk about him. I don't know if it's, I'm not saying illegal supplements and things like that, but something maybe stem cells or I don't know. I don't know how those problems have not popped up again. And that's always been why I've been worried. When you fight a guy like Gaethje, Gaethje's going to hit you. So I worry about him getting shook up again. He obviously, performed like an all-time great again and made me look stupid for even mentioning it. But you against Tuporia, you're asking to go back to 145, which I think is not a great idea. Once you moved up to 155 and you're getting older, I don't like the more extreme cuts. So, and Taporia looks like he's the kind of guy that also does damage. So, you hope that it doesn't go that way and that Max is able to stay on top of his game the way he's been, and then we'll get a great fight. At that point, Taporia may find himself against a boxer like Max that where his skill set it doesn't match up well if Max is at the top of his game. But that's what worries me. I've mentioned it probably for the last half dozen fights of Max's, and he always makes me look stupid. But again, when you get pulled out of a fight because the doctors think that you're not making sense when you're talking and you're doing things like that, that's not a great sign. And that I don't know how that just disappears.
Yeah, and I'm 100% with you on that. And I will say that so the first time I saw a Max Holloway fight, it was against Brian Ortega, and I had not studied any tape or anything like that. Like I said, at the time I was a newbie. Max Holloway was my favorite fighter. In fact, he's definitely very much up there. Dustin Poirier is number one. And when I studied the tape for that's when I started running tape a lot, was shortly thereafter, beginning of 2019. I told a buddy of mine, I said, I don't know, dude, you've been watching for a lot longer, but Dustin Poirier is legit, and Max may be a big favorite. Something tells me this is going to be Poirier's night. Oh, no. We saw what happened, right? His next fight was against Frankie Edgar. I had that one spot on. His next fight was against Alexander Volkanovski, which, not to pat myself too hard on the back, I've only had one Volkanovski fight that I picked wrong, which was the Yair Rodriguez. I just had this weird feeling Yair would catch him. He didn't. And so is that, right? And then Max, I think I actually picked Gaethje to beat him. And I think that was the only one. But regardless, I guess what I'm getting at is Max has faced great competition. I know Volkanovski is fantastic on the feet. We could go on and on about that guy and his skill set, right? Gaethje hits super, super hard, but if we're going to be honest with ourselves, Justin Gaethje isn't like the greatest from a technical aspect striker, in my opinion, right? If we're going to compare the closest opponent he's had from a technical or stylistic standpoint to Ilia Topuria, it's been Dustin Poirier. We saw what happened. Now, people can say size mattered there. Clearly, it didn't matter against Justin Gaethje. So that shows me that it's more than just a size and power difference. Dustin Poirier is a fantastic boxer. Now, am I going to say Dustin is better than Ilia or vice versa, Ilia being better than Dustin? Who knows? Two different styles of boxing. I'm just saying that it is two guys that are very, very similar, or relatively similar in their style, which is crazy because Ilia Topuria's base is jiu-jitsu. You go watch some of his first UFC performance against Yusuf Salah. He won by controlling the fight, and then he drops Bryce Mitchell. Bryce Mitchell gets back to the feet, takes Bryce Mitchell down, and submits the guy that it was either going to be him by knockout, Bryce Mitchell by submission. I just think that Max, I love him. He still will always be one of my favorite fighters, but I don't think Ilia Topuria knocks him out, but I just get this distinct feeling. And this is sans or pre-watching tape explicitly on these two guys. I just think Ilia Topuria is the real deal, man. And if Ilia Topuria gets past Max, his takedown defense is so good against a guy like Movsar Evloev, who I do think beats Aljamain Sterling. I just don't know how easy Movsar is going to be able to get him down. And if he does, how good is he off of his bat? We saw Diego Lopez put Movsar into bad positions. I think he starches Brian Ortega. I think he clowns Yair Rodriguez. He does horrible things to Aljamain Sterling. I just think Max is his hardest test. I think we're looking at, especially at his age, he's 26. We're looking at an all-time great, in my opinion. And maybe I'm jumping too hard on the guy, but I also was very low on the guy and thinking he was overrated. But either way, there's that.
Max is an all-time great, right? Just as a shout out, because one of the themes of our podcast here is you know, I imagine you're going to wrap up soon, but has been disrespected champions. You mentioned Frankie Edgar in there, you know, and there's been, like I said, there's been certain instances where the UFC has mismatched people. I think that one of the things that came to mind while you were speaking about it is that, you know, Topuria is a potential all-time great. Max is an all-time great, but there are at different ends of the spectrum. You know, Topuria is on the rise, and Max has a lot. I'm not saying he's dropped off yet, because we saw he's coming off a spectacular performance, but it was another 25-minute fight. It's a lot of miles that he's got, you know, and that's another thing that worries me about a guy with some neurological issues in the distant past at this point.
Well,
you ask him to go back to 145. He's put in a lot of miles, and he has those issues before. Those are check boxes, you know, that Topuria doesn't have. So he's carrying some baggage.
Yeah, and I agree. And I know Max holds the record for most all-time, I think it's total and significant strikes later. But I also think he unfortunately owns the record for most absorbed too. I just don't want to see him as a fan of him as a fighter and as a person. I feel like that's the type of dude that I'd love to catch a beer with and just chill with, and I think he's probably a wild time, and I think he will be a definite wild time when he's retired and not having to watch the diet, so to speak. But I just don't want to see him become that guy that was a machine like BJ Penn and then suddenly fall for another huge fall from grace. But I digress. I'm so glad to have had you on here tonight, Miguel, and I really want to have you back. If you ever want me to pop on with you, I would be so honored. This was fantastic. We got to do it again sooner as opposed to later. I don't know if you know off the top of your head your links for YouTube, et cetera, but if you do, drop them now. Tell us what you're about. Tell us about any kind of stuff you have coming up interview-wise. Let us know what's shaking with you, man, before we call it a night.
Sure, okay.
Hit us.
The YouTube channel is called MMA Museum. It's at MMA Collector 74 with my partner, Ed Tyson. So we'd love for you to join us. We do long-form interviews, and I would love to have you join us for a new segment that we have, which is called Classic Fight Review, where we go back, you know, to the 90s and watch fights that are not in the UFC, that a lot of people may not, you know, may be flying under the radar, but many of them are significant fights. I recently watched a Pride, it wasn't Pride, it was Bushido, but a fight between Misaki and Dennis Kang. That was more modern, but what we did there was I actually had Dennis join us to rewatch his own fight with us. So maybe we could do a classic fight with or without a fighter. Look at something maybe that you haven't seen. Certainly, there's many fights that come to mind, and it would be great. It's been great chatting with you, and obviously, you're becoming a student of the game. That's great.
Hey, yeah, I would love that. I would love that. And yeah, this was awesome, Miguel. Like I said, happy to have you on. We have to do it again. Everybody go give him a follow. Make sure you like, subscribe to this channel. Check us out on Spotify. The links to not only Spotify will be in the description, but as well as Miguel's channel. And yeah, until next time, everybody. As I always say, be blessed, take care, and keep living, man. LIVIN. Take care.